The bloodshed of the Boston Massacre had forced a temporary retreat by the British. Parliament, facing massive colonial boycotts organized by the Sons of Liberty, repealed most of the Townshend Acts. The colonists cheered, a victory. The power of unified economic resistance had worked. But King George III and his chief ministers were not yielding power, they were merely shifting tactics. They refused to completely concede, and, in a symbolic act designed to assert Parliament's ultimate authority, retained a single tax, a duty on tea. This wasn't about the price of a cup, it was about the principle. If Parliament could tax tea, they could tax anything. They were demanding the colonists concede the right to be taxed without their consent. For the radicals, this last remaining tax was the sticking point, the final insult. Imagine standing on King Street. The cobblestones are slick with a winter thaw, and the looming brick facade of the Custom House, the very symbol of British taxation and authority, casts a long, arrogant shadow. For years, the King's Parliament, 3,000 miles of rough ocean away, had been tightening the economic and political noose. Acts like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts were not just taxes, they were insults, violations of the fundamental British right to self-governance. Every citizen, from the fiery radical lawyer John Adams to the quiet, hard-working dock worker, felt the squeeze of the redcoats' presence. They were occupiers, not protectors. Their drums beat a relentless rhythm of submission, their muskets a constant threat. The central conflict was simple, yet deadly. Who held the power? Was it the colonists who bled and built this new land, or was it the distant monarch, George III, who saw America only as a revenue stream? But the shift from grumbling complaint to open revolt did not happen in a flash, it happened in a whisper. It happened in the smoky back rooms of taverns like the Green Dragon, where secret societies like the Sons of Liberty met under cover of night. Here, men like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams plotted their defiance, not with guns yet, but with ink. They organized boycotts, printed inflammatory pamphlets, and systematically dismantled the authority of royal officials, piece by bloody piece. They were rebranding legitimate dissent as treason, a crime punishable by the gallows. The stage was set for collision. In this climate of escalating tension, the smallest spark could ignite the continent. That spark came on a cold March night. A few rowdy colonists taunting a lone British sentry near the customs house quickly escalated into a riot. Soon, a line of 8 British soldiers, terrified and surrounded by a screaming mob throwing snowballs laced with stones, leveled their muskets. Then came the flash, the roar, the smoke. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead or dying on the cobblestones. The first to fall, a mixed-race sailor and stevedore named Crispus Attucks, would become the first martyr for American liberty. The Boston Massacre was not just a tragic event, it was the story America needed to justify its rebellion. The incident was immediately seized upon, engraved by Revere, and distributed across the colonies. The message was clear: the King's army had drawn first blood. The time for petitions was over. The time for resistance had begun. The question was no longer if they would fight, but how they would face the most powerful military force in the world. Entered the East India Company, a powerful corporation that was collapsing in debt and had 17 million pounds of unsold tea rotting in English warehouses. Parliament, seeing a chance to bail out the company and enforce the tax, passed the Tea Act of 1773. This act gave the East India Company a virtual monopoly, allowing them to sell tea directly to the colonies at prices cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea the patriots were drinking. The colonial merchants hated it because it cut them out of the trade. The patriots hated it because it was a clever ploy to trick the average citizen into accepting the principle of taxation just for a cheaper beverage. The Sons of Liberty knew they had to act decisively. They had to make an unforgettable, dramatic statement that would show the king they could not be bought or intimidated. The moment came in December 1773, when 3 ships loaded with the hated tea, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, docked in Boston Harbor. On the night of December 16, 1773, a crowd of thousands gathered to witness what was to come. As the evening drew dark and cold, a column of 50 to 60 men emerged from the crowd. They were disguised, smeared with soot and paint, and loosely dressed in Native American garb, a theatrical attempt to mask their identities and symbolize an American resistance, not a British faction. Led by figures like Samuel Adams and others, the disguised colonists silently boarded the ships. The destruction was methodical, not riotous. They used ropes and pulleys to hoist the massive wooden chests, weighing hundreds of pounds each, from the hold. With axes and hatchets, they split the chests open, and the contents, a fortune in dry, leafy bohea and singlow, were systematically emptied into the frigid salt water below. The air filled with the strong, bitter aroma of wasted profit and audacious rebellion. For 3 hours, the only sounds were the crunch of wood, the splash of the tea, and the muffled cheers of the crowd watching from the docks. By the time the Sons of Liberty were finished, 340 chests of tea, worth nearly $1 million in today's money, floated in the harbor. This was no riot. This was a calculated, deliberate act of economic terrorism against the crown. The Boston Tea Party was the point of no return. It was an open declaration of war on the king's authority. When King George III heard the news, his response was thunderous and unforgiving. The die now cast. The colonies either triumph or submit. Parliament immediately responded with a series of draconian laws the colonists dubbed the Intolerable Acts, closing the port of Boston, replacing the colonial government with a military regime, and allowing British officials to be tried in England instead of America. The intention was to crush Boston and isolate it. The result was the exact opposite. The rest of the colonies realized that what was happening to Boston today could happen to them tomorrow. They began to organize, not as separate colonies, but as a unified front. The Intolerable Acts, designed to isolate and punish Massachusetts, had instead lit a fire under the 12 other colonies. They saw the ruin of Boston as a warning, and their collective fear quickly hardened into collective action. The time for secret meetings in smoky taverns was over. It was time for a formal, unified government. In September 1774, the most influential leaders from every colony except Georgia converged on Philadelphia. They were lawyers, planters, merchants, and firebrands, united by a common understanding. If they did not stand together, they would surely hang separately. This was the First Continental Congress. Imagine the scene in Carpenter's Hall. The air is thick with history yet to be made. 56 delegates, men who risked everything simply by attending, filled the room. These men were not seeking independence yet. They were seeking a remedy. They were trying to preserve their rights as Englishmen who believed they had been illegally deprived of self-governance. The ideological clash within the Congress was fierce. On one side were the radical voices, primarily from New England, led by John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams. They argued for immediate, aggressive resistance, believing the king would never truly compromise. They wanted to shut down all trade with Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. On the other side were the conservative delegates, who still held deep loyalty to the crown and feared the economic chaos and bloodshed of war. They hoped for a peaceful resolution, a plea for royal mercy. The Congress ultimately sided with the radicals. Their first major decision was the creation of the Continental Association, a sweeping, comprehensive plan for an economic boycott. They pledged to stop importing all British goods starting in December 1774, and if their grievances were not addressed by the following September, they would stop exporting American goods to Britain too. This was an ultimatum, an act of commercial warfare that hit the British economy where it hurt most. Crucially, the Congress also authorized the creation of committees of safety and committees of inspection in every town. These committees were charged with enforcing the boycott, identifying loyalists, Tories, and effectively dismantling the vestiges of royal government in the colonies. They were the first seeds of a functioning American government. They drafted a formal Declaration of Rights and Grievances, laying out their constitutional objections to Parliament's authority, particularly the right to legislate or tax the colonies without their consent. They sent this petition directly to King George III, hoping he would intervene on their behalf. But George III viewed the petition not as a request, but as an act of open rebellion. He saw only the aggressive economic warfare and the dismantling of his authority. When the petition arrived in London, the king declared the colonies to be in a state of outright revolt. By the time the delegates adjourned in October 1774, they had set a date for a second Continental Congress should their demands not be met. They were buying time, but everyone knew time was running out. They had armed themselves not only with political resolutions, but with the understanding that the next time they met, they might be signing their names to the death warrant of a new nation. The stage had shifted from the docks of Boston to the town commons and village greens across America, where citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers began drilling and stockpiling gunpowder. They became known as Minutemen, citizen soldiers ready to fight at a moment's notice. The spring of 1775 was a season of nervous preparation. In Massachusetts, the British military presence was now under the command of General Thomas Gage, who also served as the royal governor. Gage knew the colonists were stockpiling weapons and powder in violation of royal law, and he knew these stores had to be confiscated if he was to prevent a full-scale insurrection. The biggest cache was rumored to be in the rural town of Concord, about 20 miles outside of Boston. Additionally, two of the Revolution's most wanted agitators, Samuel Adams and Hancock Jr., were rumored to be staying in the nearby village of Lexington. General Gage decided on a swift, secretive surgical strike. On the night of April 18, 1775, under the cover of darkness, about 700 elite British regulars, the Redcoats, were silently ferried across the Charles River and began their march inland. Their orders were clear: seize the arms at Concord and arrest Adams and Hancock. But the colonists were prepared. The network of intelligence built by the Sons of Liberty was operational. As soon as the movement of the regulars was confirmed, the famous signal was sent from the Old North Church, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. 2 lanterns in the steeple warned that the British were coming by boat across the river. Instantly, riders were dispatched. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott rode through the night, rousing the countryside. They did not shout, "The British are coming," for most still considered themselves British. Instead, they warned, "The regulars are out." As dawn broke on April 19th, the first elements of the British column reached the Lexington Green. Waiting for them were approximately 70 colonial militia, the Minutemen, hastily assembled and commanded by Captain John Parker. They stood in a ragged line, vastly outnumbered, with muskets loaded but unsure of their next move. Major John Pitcairn, commanding the advance British unit, rode forward and ordered the rebels, "Disperse, ye rebels, lay down your arms and disperse." Captain Parker, knowing the futility of fighting a battle they could not win, began to order his men to stand down, but in the tense, confused confrontation, someone,
Historians still debate whether it was a nervous militiaman or an overzealous British soldier fired a shot. That single shot heard around the world shattered the stillness. The redcoats immediately unleashed a devastating volley. When the smoke cleared, 8 Minutemen were dead and 10 others were wounded. The rest scattered. The British cheered their small victory and marched on towards Concord. In Concord, the British found most of the arms already removed, but they destroyed what they could. This time, however, the Minutemen had gathered their strength. Hundreds of militia units from the surrounding towns descended on the town, skirmishing with the British at the North Bridge. This time, the Americans held their ground and forced the British to retreat. The retreat was a disaster. As the exhausted British column marched the 20 miles back to Boston, they were subjected to a continuous, humiliating ambush. Colonial militia lined the entire route, firing behind trees, stone walls, and buildings, a brutal, guerrilla-style warfare the British were unprepared for. The Redcoats suffered devastating casualties, 73 killed and over 170 wounded. The militia losses were far lighter. The day of April 19, 1775, was not a conventional battle. It was a demonstration that the colonists were not only willing to fight, but could inflict serious pain on the professional British Army. The Revolution had begun. The blood spilled at Lexington and Concord was the indelible ink confirming that the colonies and the Crown were now at war.
Following the bloody running battle of Lexington and Concord, the victorious colonial militia didn't go home. Instead, they surrounded Boston, trapping General Gage and his British forces within the city. Thousands of citizen soldiers, farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers had formed a ragged, decentralized siege army. The war was officially underway. The Second Congress and the commander. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775. The situation had dramatically changed. Their task was no longer petitioning the king, but waging war. Their first and most critical action was to transform the scattered regional militias into a unified fighting force, the Continental Army. To lead this army, Congress needed a man who could unite the disparate colonies. The choice was vital, both politically and militarily. They settled on George Washington, a wealthy Virginian planter and respected veteran of the French and Indian War. Washington possessed the necessary military experience and, crucially, came from the South. By choosing him, the New England-dominated rebellion became a truly continental effort, securing the vital support of the powerful Southern colonies. Washington accepted the command, refusing pay, asking only that his expenses be covered. The Bloody Height. Before Washington could even reach Boston, the first major conventional battle of the war exploded. General Gage, tired of being bottled up, planned to occupy the hills surrounding the city to break the siege. The colonists anticipated this move. On the night of June 16, 1775, American Colonel William Prescott led 1,200 men onto the strategic heights known as Breed's Hill, though the battle is historically named after the adjacent Bunker Hill. Working through the dark hours, they furiously dug in, constructing a strong dirt breastwork, a makeshift fort overlooking Boston Harbor. When the sun rose on June 17th, General Gage was furious to see the American fortification aimed directly at his fleet and the city. He immediately ordered an assault. The British attack was a display of spectacular, terrifying military might. General William Howe led 2,400 redcoats, perfectly dressed, bayonets fixed, and marching in parade ground formation straight up the steep, grassy hill toward the American defenses. The colonists, short on gunpowder, were given a famous, desperate order: "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes."
They held their nerve. The first 2 British assaults were met with a disciplined, devastating torrent of close-range musket fire. The American volley was so lethal and unexpected that the British lines were simply shredded, sending the finest soldiers in the world reeling back down the hill in panicked disarray. The third assault, however, was successful. The Americans had finally exhausted their meager supply of ammunition. The Redcoats surged over the earthworks, engaging the defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat using bayonets. The Americans were forced to retreat, though they did so in relatively good order. A Pyrrhic victory. The British technically won the battle and secured the ground, but the victory came at a catastrophic cost. They suffered over 1,000 casualties, killed and wounded, amounting to nearly half their attacking force. The colonists, by contrast, suffered around 450 casualties. The Battle of Bunker Hill sent a chilling message to London. The American militia was not a rabble that would run at the first sound of cannon fire. They could and would stand up to the regulars and inflict punishing damage. A shaken General Gage observed, "The Americans are not a contemptible enemy." The Patriots had lost the hill, but they had won a colossal psychological victory, proving that the war for independence would be long, bloody, and hard-fought. General George Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts in July 1775 to take command of the Continental Army. What he found was not a proper army, but a collection of enthusiastic, indisciplined, and poorly equipped militias. Their uniforms were ragged, their pay was non-existent, and their enlistments were often short-term, meaning his entire force could simply melt away when the harvest season arrived. Washington, a stickler for order and professional discipline, faced a monumental task, transforming this mixed multitude into a force capable of defeating the professional British Army. He immediately implemented strict rules, began drilling the men relentlessly, and worked to instill the sense of unity and purpose required to win a war of attrition. The problem of the siege. The siege of Boston had settled into a frustrating stalemate. The British were confined to the city, but the Americans lacked the heavy artillery necessary to drive them out or dislodge them from their warships in the harbor. The solution came from an unlikely source, Fort Ticonderoga. This old, dilapidated British fort, situated hundreds of miles away in upstate New York, had been captured by a surprise raid led by Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys in May 1775. Crucially, the fort was packed with 60 tons of heavy cannon and mortars, precisely what Washington needed. But the cannons were useless sitting in the wilderness. Washington needed a man bold enough and brilliant enough to move them. The noble train of artillery. The man chosen for this impossible mission was Colonel Henry Knox, a 25-year-old self-taught military expert and former bookseller from Boston. Knox, a jovial giant of a man, had zero experience in artillery or engineering, but he had an abundance of courage and determination. Beginning in November 1775, Knox undertook what became known as the Noble Train of Artillery. He supervised the dismantling, loading, and transport of 59 heavy cannons and mortars. They were loaded on huge wooden sledges, specially constructed for the journey. Knox and his men then dragged these massive iron and bronze pieces through the wilderness of upstate New York and across the snow-covered Berkshires of western Massachusetts. The 300-mile journey was an epic struggle against nature. They had to cross 2 frozen rivers, haul the heavy guns up steep mountain slopes using oxen and rope, and keep the expedition moving through blizzards and treacherous ice. After nearly 3 months of grueling labor, Knox delivered the entire arsenal to Cambridge in January 1776, an astonishing feat of logistics that stunned both the Americans and the British. Washington had his weapon. The decisive moment came on the night of March 4th, 1776. Under absolute secrecy, Washington ordered his troops to occupy and fortify Dorchester Heights, a high ground commanding the southern approach to Boston. Using a brilliant strategy to muffle the sounds of construction, piling hay and using blankets, and aided by a fog that obscured their activity, the Americans worked through the night. By dawn, the British awoke to a shocking sight. The massive cannons from Ticonderoga were aimed directly down at the city and the harbor. General Howe, now commanding the British forces, knew the city was indefensible under the threat of that artillery. He famously remarked that the American position had been fortified with an industry scarcely credible. Rather than risk another suicidal assault like Bunker Hill, Howe made the only rational military decision. On March 17, 1776, the British evacuated Boston entirely, sailing away to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Washington had won his first major victory of the war, a bloodless one that was purely the result of superior strategy and logistics. The city that had started the rebellion was finally free of the King's troops.
The victory in Boston gave the Continental Congress the critical confidence boost it needed. With the redcoats gone and the armies mobilized, the conversation in Philadelphia shifted from seeking reconciliation to demanding separation. A year of war had confirmed what the radicals had long argued. King George III would never recognize colonial rights. The Great Debate. The pivotal moment arrived on June 7, 1776, when Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood before the Congress and introduced a resolution with 3 parts. That these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. That they should take measures for forming foreign alliances. That a plan of confederation should be prepared for the colonies. This was treason formalized. The debate that followed was intense. Many delegates still hesitated, fearing the immense power of the British military and the economic ruin that independence would surely bring. They argued that the colonies were too fragile, too disunited, and lacked the necessary foreign support. However, the powerful eloquence of men like John Adams swayed the momentum. He argued that the time of equivocation was over. War had begun, and only as independent nations could they secure alliances with France and Spain, which were crucial to victory. On June 11th, Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal document explaining their decision to the world. This committee of 5 included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert R. Livingston, and crucially, the young, eloquent Virginian Thomas Jefferson. The pen of a nation. Though Adams and Franklin were more prominent statesmen, the task of writing the primary draft fell to the 33-year-old Jefferson. He retreated to his rented room and over 2 weeks poured the revolutionary philosophy of the Enlightenment onto parchment. The document he produced was far more than a list of complaints against the king. It was a philosophical statement of human liberty that has echoed through the centuries. The most powerful section, the preamble, declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This was the immortal sentence, the statement that transformed the rebellion from a mere political dispute into a struggle for universal human rights. The final step. On July 2, 1776, Congress formally adopted Lee's resolution, effectively voting for independence. John Adams immediately wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail, proclaiming that this date will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America.
2 days later, on July 4, 1776, after rigorous debate and some minor editing, the Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. The delegates realized the gravity of what they had done. By affixing their names to this document, they were not just starting a country, they were committing the highest act of treason against the British Crown. Every signature was a potential death warrant. As John Hancock, the president of the Congress, signed his name with a famously large, bold flourish, he allegedly remarked, "The king can read that without his spectacles." The Declaration was immediately printed and distributed throughout the newly declared states and to the Continental Army. The Declaration changed everything. It provided the ultimate ideological justification for the war. It turned the citizen soldiers from rebels into patriots, fighting not for a reduction in taxes, but for the creation of an entirely new nation founded on the principles of liberty and self-governance. The Declaration has been signed, but the British Army has landed in force near New York. Washington faces his first major test as commander of a newly declared nation. How will he fare against the full might of the British military? The celebrations following the signing of the Declaration of Independence were short-lived. The ink was barely dry when the most formidable invasion force Britain had ever assembled sailed into American waters. In the summer of 1776, General William Howe, fresh from his evacuation of Boston, arrived near New York City with a massive fleet commanded by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. They brought over 32,000 professional British and Hessian or German mercenary troops, supported by hundreds of warships. This force dwarfed Washington's Continental Army, which numbered less than 20,000 men, many of them militia with minimal training. Washington correctly guessed that New York, with its vital port and strategic rivers, would be the next target. Despite the city being virtually indefensible, he felt compelled to try and hold it, to maintain the morale of the newly declared nation. The Battle of Long Island. The main confrontation occurred in late August 1776 on Long Island, now Brooklyn. Washington unwisely divided his forces, stationing 10,000 troops on the western end of the island. General Howe, a cautious but capable commander, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver. While the Americans focused on the British forces engaging them from the front, Howe marched the bulk of his army around the American left flank, surprising the Continentals from the rear. The result was a devastating rout. The American army suffered over 1,000 casualties and lost critical ground. Washington was trapped. The British held the high ground, and the sea was commanded by the massive Royal Navy. The American army was poised for total destruction, a defeat that would have ended the Revolution in its infancy. The midnight escape. Facing utter catastrophe, Washington knew a decisive battle could not be won. He decided on a desperate, high-risk maneuver that would save his army, if not the city. On the night of August 29, 1776, under a cloak of heavy fog and rain, Washington orchestrated a masterful evacuation. Using every available boat and barge, supervised by the experienced fishermen of Marblehead, Massachusetts, Washington silently ferried his entire army, men, horses, cannon, and supplies, across the mile-wide East River from Long Island to Manhattan. The silence was paramount. To mask the sound of moving wheels, they wrapped the wagon spokes in rags. Washington personally oversaw the operation, not crossing to safety until the very last men were evacuated. When the fog finally lifted on the morning of August 30th, 1776, the British were astonished to find empty American trenches. The enemy had vanished. The retreat. Although the escape was a miracle of logistics, the campaign was a disaster. The loss of Long Island was followed by a series of retreats and defeats throughout the fall. The Continental Army was pushed out of Manhattan, then from White Plains, and finally across New Jersey. Morale plummeted. The term of enlistment for many soldiers was about to expire, and men began deserting in droves. By December 1776, the Continental Army had dwindled to only a few thousand effective fighting men, freezing, starving, and chased relentlessly by the well-fed, victorious British. The revolution was on the verge of collapse. General Washington was publicly ridiculed, Congress had fled Philadelphia, and many were already contemplating surrender. The only thing standing between the British conquest of America and a desperate, fragile hope was the resolve of one man and the battered, retreating few who remained loyal.
The celebrations following the signing of the Declaration of Independence were short-lived. The ink was barely dry when the most formidable invasion force Britain had ever assembled sailed into American waters. In the summer of 1776, General William Howe, fresh from his evacuation of Boston, arrived near New York City with a massive fleet commanded by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. They brought over 32,000 professional British and Hessian or German mercenary troops, supported by hundreds of warships. This force dwarfed Washington's Continental Army, which numbered less than 20,000 men, many of them militia with minimal training. Washington correctly guessed that New York, with its vital port and strategic rivers, would be the next target. Despite the city being virtually indefensible, he felt compelled to try and hold it to maintain the morale of the newly declared nation. The Battle of Long Island. The main confrontation occurred in late August 1776 on Long Island, now Brooklyn. Washington unwisely divided his forces, stationing 10,000 troops on the western end of the island. General Howe, a cautious but capable commander, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver. While the Americans focused on the British forces engaging them from the front, Howe marched the bulk of his army around the American left flank, surprising the Continentals from the rear. The result was a devastating rout. The American army suffered over 1,000 casualties and lost critical ground. Washington was trapped. The British held the high ground, and the sea was commanded by the massive Royal Navy. The American army was poised for total destruction, a defeat that would have ended the Revolution in its infancy. The midnight escape. Facing utter catastrophe, Washington knew a decisive battle could not be won. He decided on a desperate, high-risk maneuver that would save his army, if not the city. On night August 29, 1776, under a cloak of heavy fog and rain, Washington orchestrated a masterful evacuation. Using every available boat and barge, supervised by the experienced fishermen of Marblehead, Massachusetts, Washington silently ferried his entire army, men, horses, cannon, and supplies, across the mile-wide East River from Long Island to Manhattan. The silence was paramount. To mask the sound of moving wheels, they wrapped the wagon spokes in rags. Washington personally oversaw the operation, not crossing to safety until the very last men were evacuated. When the fog finally lifted on the morning of August 30th, the British were astonished to find empty American trenches. The enemy had vanished. The retreat. Though the escape was a miracle of logistics, the campaign was a disaster. The loss of Long Island was followed by a series of retreats and defeats throughout the fall. The Continental Army was pushed out of Manhattan, then from White Plains, and finally across New Jersey. Morale plummeted. The term of enlistment for many soldiers was about to expire, and men began deserting in droves. By December 1776, the Continental Army had dwindled to only a few thousand effective fighting men, freezing, starving, and chased relentlessly by the well-fed, victorious British. The Revolution was on the verge of collapse. General Washington was publicly ridiculed. Congress had fled Philadelphia, and many were already contemplating surrender. The only thing standing between the British conquest of America and a desperate, fragile hope was the resolve of one man and the battered, retreating few who remained loyal.
The victories at Trenton and Princeton revitalized the American cause, but the Continental Army was still a fledgling force fighting the largest empire on Earth. To win, America desperately needed two things: massive financial support and a powerful military alliance. Both hinged on convincing the courts of Europe, particularly France, that the American rebellion was a serious, viable, long-term venture. The diplomatic mission. In Paris, the task of selling the revolution fell primarily to Benjamin Franklin, one of the most famous men in the world. Franklin was a master diplomat, leveraging his fame as a scientist and philosopher to charm the sophisticated French society. He presented the American cause not just as a political squabble, but as a fight for the Enlightenment ideals that were fashionable in French aristocratic circles. The French, still smarting from their defeat by Britain in the French and Indian War, were eager to see their rival empire weakened. However, the foreign minister, Comte de Vergennes, would not risk a costly war with Britain unless the Americans could prove they could defeat the British Army in a major conventional battle. The campaign in the North. The main British plan for 1777 was to split the colonies by seizing control of the Hudson River Valley, isolating the radical New England states from the rest. The main thrust of this strategy was entrusted to General John Burgoyne, known for his flair and theatrical confidence, but also his arrogance. Burgoyne began his campaign by marching south from Canada, capturing Fort Ticonderoga, and moving an enormous baggage train, including his personal china and fine wines, slowly through the wilderness of upstate New York. He expected easily to meet up with other British forces moving north from New York City. However, the Americans, led by General Horatio Gates, skillfully used the rugged terrain to their advantage. They felled trees and destroyed bridges, slowing Burgoyne's march to a crawl. Meanwhile, American militia flocked to the area, sensing an opportunity to entrap the large British force. The turning point at Saratoga. The decisive confrontation occurred at Saratoga in two major battles in September and October 1777. In the first engagement, on September 19th, the Americans held their ground against the British main advance. The second, more decisive battle, on October 7th, saw a fierce American counterattack, brilliantly led by General Benedict Arnold before his infamous treason. Arnold's forces smashed through the British lines, inflicting heavy casualties and shattering Burgoyne's offensive capability. Burgoyne's army was completely encircled, exhausted, and running out of supplies. On October 17, 1777, General Burgoyne formally surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men to the Americans. The Battle of Saratoga was the true military turning point of the Revolution. The French alliance. When news of the staggering American victory reached Paris, it was the proof Vergennes needed. America was not a lost cause, it was a powerful, emerging nation. In February 1778, France formally recognized the independence of the United States and signed the Treaty of Alliance. This agreement was a game changer. France provided money, weapons, and military supplies. Crucially, the French promised to send a powerful army and, most importantly, their navy. The conflict was instantly transformed from a colonial rebellion into a global war. Britain now faced fighting not just in America, but in Europe, the West Indies, and India. The French Navy, with its capacity to challenge British dominance at sea, made a final American victory a realistic possibility for the first time.
The victory at Saratoga was followed by a winter of legendary hardship. While the diplomatic victory was being secured in the drawing rooms of Paris, the Continental Army had to find refuge from the severe winter of 1777-1778. Washington chose a desolate, defensible plateau called Valley Forge, about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia, which was now occupied by the British under General Howe. The location was strategic, close enough to monitor the British, but rugged enough to prevent a surprise attack. The Winter of Suffering. The conditions at Valley Forge were appalling. The army was poorly supplied, not because the country lacked food, but because the decentralized Congress and state governments struggled with organization and transportation. Corrupt contractors and a depreciating currency meant that food, clothing, and blankets often failed to reach the men. The soldiers, many of whom were already weakened by months of campaigning, arrived without proper shelter. They immediately set about building a city of 1,000 log cabins according to Washington's strict plans. Disease was the greatest enemy. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia spread rapidly through the crowded, unsanitary camp. By the end of the winter, nearly 2,500 soldiers died from illness, starvation, and exposure. More casualties than the army suffered in most of the major battles of the war combined. Washington personally suffered as he watched his men endure this preventable agony, writing to Congress repeatedly of the desperate need for provisions. The survival of the army became a test of sheer human endurance and loyalty to Washington himself. The Barren and the Transformation. Despite the suffering, Valley Forge became the birthplace of the professional Continental Army. This transformation was largely due to the arrival of an unlikely savior, Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Von Steuben was a Prussian military officer and self-proclaimed baron, though his noble credentials were questionable, who had been sent to America by Franklin. He spoke little English, but possessed an enormous amount of tactical knowledge and a fiery, demanding presence. Washington immediately recognized von Steuben's talent and put him to work as the acting inspector general. Von Steuben didn't just drill the soldiers, he simplified the complex European maneuvers into a streamlined, easily digestible manual written in English. He personally trained a model company, drilling them relentlessly in the basics of military posture, musket handling, bayonet usage, and marching formations. Von Steuben's genius was in adapting his methods to the American temperament, replacing traditional European harshness with a charismatic fury that earned the respect of the troops. By the time the army marched out of Valley Forge in June of 1778, they were no longer a ragtag collection of militias. They were a cohesive, well-drilled, professional force, an army capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British regulars. The entry of France into the war drastically changed British strategy. With the French Navy posing a threat to the coast and the North locked in a stalemate, the British decided to shift their focus to the southern colonies, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia. The new British plan, called the Southern Strategy, was based on the belief that a massive base of Loyalist or Tory support existed in the South, particularly among inland farmers and planters who resented the coastal elite who led the rebellion. The British hoped to pacify the South state by state, use the Loyalists as a local militia, and then squeeze the North into submission. The British seized the coast. The strategy began with stunning success. In December 1779, the British captured Savannah, Georgia. 2 years later, in May of 1730, the most disastrous American defeat of the war occurred. The British, under General Clinton and General Cornwallis, besieged and captured Charleston, South Carolina, taking over 5,000 Continental and militia troops as prisoners. The British now controlled the two largest ports in the South. Following Charleston, Cornwallis systematically marched inland, defeating an American army at Camden in August of 1730, a battle so devastating it shattered the American command in the region. Just when the Revolution seemed lost in the South,
The conflict devolved into a brutal, bitter civil war fought between loyalist and patriot neighbors. The regular armies struggled to control the vast countryside, leaving a vacuum filled by ruthless guerrilla leaders. This phase was marked by the rise of iconic American figures who knew the land intimately. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Marion led a small brigade of militia that utilized the dense swamps and forests of South Carolina to evade the British. They hit fast and vanished instantly, destroying supply lines, rescuing prisoners, and keeping the British perpetually off balance. Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, led larger partisan groups, focusing on disrupting British movements and rallying the local populace. These guerrilla fighters acted as the eyes and ears of the American cause, refusing to let the British establish full control. They became the relentless, stinging resistance that sapped British strength and morale. Turning the tide in the interior. The fortunes began to shift in the interior. The British suffered a devastating blow when a large force of loyalists commanded by Major Patrick Ferguson was trapped and annihilated by a force of patriot militia and over-mountain men at the Battle of Kings Mountain, October 1780. This victory was achieved entirely by American patriots, killing, capturing, or scattering the entire Loyalist force. Another decisive turning point came at the Battle of Cowpens, January 1781. American General Daniel Morgan executed a brilliant tactical maneuver, utilizing a tiered defense where he placed his militia in the front line with orders to fire only 2 volleys before retreating. The British charged forward, thinking the Americans were routing, only to be met by Morgan's disciplined Continental regulars waiting behind the hill. The British force was virtually destroyed. These victories broke the back of the Loyalist movement and forced Cornwallis to abandon his interior control strategy and chase the American armies north into Virginia. The Southern strategy had failed.
The year 1781 brought the war to its climactic phase. Following the devastating American victories in the South, General Cornwallis abandoned the Carolinas and marched his army north into Virginia, hoping to secure supplies and establish a strong coastal base where he could be reinforced or evacuated by the Royal Navy. He eventually settled his 7,500 troops at Yorktown, a small village on the York River, believing the British control of the sea made his position unassailable. The brilliant deception. George Washington, stationed in the north, and the French general Comte de Rochambeau, commanding 5,000 French troops, watched Cornwallis's movements. They saw the opportunity. Washington and Rochambeau were initially planning an assault on the main British headquarters in New York City. However, they received crucial intelligence. Admiral de Grasse, commanding the powerful French fleet in the West Indies, was sailing north and could provide crucial naval superiority for a limited time. Washington made the most important strategic decision of his life. He abruptly abandoned the plan to attack New York and, in a masterful move of deception, began marching the combined Franco-American army, about 7,000 Continentals and 5,000 French, south toward Virginia. To keep the British commander, Sir Henry Clinton, pinned down in New York, Washington used elaborate feints and false documents to convince Clinton that the attack on New York was imminent until the marching army was well underway. Sealing the water. The success of the entire operation hinged on the French Navy. In early September 1781, Admiral de Grasse engaged the main British fleet in the Battle of the Chesapeake. This naval clash, which lasted for several days, was a strategic American victory. Though not sinking many ships, de Grasse forced the British fleet to retreat, leaving the Chesapeake Bay completely blockaded. This was the key. Cornwallis was now cut off. The army was trapped on land by Washington and Rochambeau, and escape or resupply by sea was impossible. The siege and surrender.
The combined Franco-American army arrived at Yorktown in late September. They quickly began establishing siege lines, digging parallel trenches closer and closer to the British fortifications. The French provided the necessary siege cannons, engineers, and heavy artillery. The siege was brutal and methodical. The Allied forces bombarded the British positions day and night, methodically dismantling the defenses. The final critical actions were the nighttime assaults on two key British redoubts, fortifications. The French stormed one, and the American Continentals, led by the young Marquis de Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton, stormed the other, seizing both positions with disciplined bayonet charges. With his outer defenses gone, his troops sick and exhausted, and his lines battered by artillery fire, Cornwallis had no hope of relief. On October 17, 1781, Cornwallis sent a drummer boy with a white flag to signal a request for terms of surrender. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, the official surrender ceremony took place. Cornwallis, claiming illness, sent his second-in-command to hand over his sword. The American forces were commanded by General Washington and the French forces by Rochambeau. The British military band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." The surrender at Yorktown effectively broke the British will to continue the war. Though fighting would sputter on for 2 more years, the major military victory had been won. The surrender at Yorktown sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. When Lord North, the British Prime Minister, heard the news, he reportedly cried out, "Oh God, it is all over." Although British garrisons still held New York City, Charleston, and Savannah, the political will to continue the enormously expensive war had collapsed in London. The peace negotiations. The peace negotiations began in Paris in April 1782. Congress dispatched a formidable delegation of American diplomats. Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman and diplomatic master who had secured the French alliance; John Adams, the fiery legal mind who insisted on strong terms for American sovereignty; John Jay, the cautious and brilliant New Yorker who was highly skeptical of French and Spanish motives. The negotiations were complex, involving France, Spain, and Great Britain. The American delegates faced a major hurdle. France and Spain, while allies, had their own territorial ambitions and were primarily concerned with weakening Britain, not necessarily ensuring America's full independence. John Jay, suspecting that the French Foreign Minister Vergennes was trying to limit American westward expansion, convinced Adams and Franklin to negotiate directly with the British, bypassing the French, a daring diplomatic maneuver. Defining the borders. The British, eager to separate the Americans from the French alliance, proved surprisingly generous in the initial talks. The American delegates pushed for and received 3 crucial concessions that defined the future of the nation. Full independence. Great Britain formally and unequivocally recognized the United States as free, sovereign, and independent states. Territorial expansion. The new nation's boundaries were set, extending all the way west to the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes, and south to the border of Spanish Florida. This enormous grant of territory secured the future economic growth of the United States. Fishing rights. Americans were granted fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, a vital economic activity for New England. The final document, the Treaty of Paris, was signed on September 3, 1783. The American Revolution was officially over. The farewell and the legacy. In November 1783, the last British troops departed New York City. Weeks later, in an emotional scene at Flounce's Tavern in New York City, George Washington gathered his remaining officers. He toasted them, embraced them individually, and formally resigned his commission, stating his intention to retire to his home at Mount Vernon. This final act was perhaps his most revolutionary.
By voluntarily relinquishing the power he had wielded as commander-in-chief, Washington set a powerful, non-monarchical precedent. He proved to the world that the American Revolution was fought for liberty and republican principles, not for the personal gain of a single dictator or king. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, was not just a war, it was the birth of an idea. It replaced the principle of monarchy and aristocracy with the revolutionary, self-evident truth that all men are created equal and have a right to self-governance. Though the immediate reality of the nation fell short of those ideals, particularly concerning slavery and the rights of women and Native Americans, the Declaration and the war provided the permanent, powerful blueprint, the American creed, that future generations would use to fight for greater liberty and justice. The American experiment had begun.
The joy of victory and the establishment of peace were quickly overshadowed by a harsh realization: winning independence was easier than governing a new nation. The years immediately following the Revolution, from 1783 to 1787, became known as the critical period, a time when the entire American experiment teetered on the brink of collapse. The weakness of the Articles. The government created during the war was defined by the Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1781. The central feature of the Articles was its deliberate weakness. Having just overthrown a powerful monarchy, the states feared a strong central authority. They created a league of sovereign states, where the national government consisted only of a single legislative body, Congress, with severely limited powers. The biggest flaws included no power to tax. Congress could not directly tax the citizens or the states. It could only request money from the states, which often refused to pay. This left the national government perpetually bankrupt, unable to pay its war debts or even pay its own soldiers. No national executive or judiciary. There was no president or independent court system to enforce the laws Congress passed or to resolve disputes between the states. Difficulty in passing legislation. Any major measure required the approval of 9 out of the 13 states. Amending the Articles required unanimous consent, making change virtually impossible. Unable to regulate commerce. The states began imposing tariffs and duties on goods imported from other states, creating trade barriers and economic chaos within the Confederation itself. The result was an economic crisis. Debt piled up, currency rapidly depreciated, and foreign governments, seeing the national government's impotence, refused to enter into trade agreements. Western lands and the Northwest Ordinances. Despite its flaws, the Confederation Congress did achieve 2 crucial successes regarding the vast territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. These acts, known as the Northwest Ordinances, established a framework for managing expansion and turning territories into states. It provided an orderly process for new territories to become states on an equal footing with the original 13, preventing the original states from colonizing the new territories. Crucially, the 1787 ordinance banned slavery in the vast Northwest Territory, the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. This established a dividing line that would define the political fault lines of the nation for decades to come. Shays' Rebellion, the breaking point. The crisis revealed by Shays' Rebellion convinced the key leaders that a mere revision of the Articles of Confederation would be insufficient. A new political foundation was needed. In May 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused to attend, convened in the State House in Philadelphia, the very same hall where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. This gathering became known as the Constitutional Convention. The rules of secrecy. The first crucial decision
was to conduct all proceedings in absolute secrecy. The windows were nailed shut despite the stifling summer heat. This rule, strictly enforced, allowed delegates to speak their minds freely, change their positions without public pressure, and ultimately forge compromises without immediate political repercussions. The convention was led by George Washington, whose presence lent immense credibility and authority to the proceedings. The intellectual driving force, however, was James Madison of Virginia. Madison, having meticulously studied past republics and confederacies, arrived with a fully formed plan and took comprehensive notes that serve as the primary record of the debates. The Great Divide, representation. The delegates immediately realized they were not merely fixing the articles, but drafting an entirely new system. The central conflict that threatened to derail the convention was the issue of representation in the new national legislature. The Virginia Plan, large state plan, proposed by Madison and championed by Randolph, this plan called for a strong national government with a bicameral, two-house legislature. Representation in both houses would be based on the state's population. Naturally, this was favored by the large states, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. The New Jersey Plan, small state plan, proposed by William Patterson, sought to retain the structure of the Articles, where all states had equal representation in a single legislature, regardless of population. This was fiercely advocated by the small states, Delaware, New Jersey, etc., who feared being completely swallowed by the larger states. The debate dragged on for weeks, becoming increasingly acrimonious. The convention was on the verge of collapsing, which would have been the end of the Union. The Connecticut Compromise. The resolution came in the form of the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, brokered by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. This solution satisfied both sides. The House of Representatives would satisfy the large states by having representation based on the state's population. The Senate would satisfy the small states by granting equal representation to all states, 2 senators per state, regardless of population. This fundamental compromise created the framework for the legislative branch we know today. The slave question. Another bitter issue was how to count the enslaved population for the purposes of representation and taxation. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation to increase their political power, but not for taxation. Northern states argued the opposite. The convention resolved this with the deeply controversial 3/5 compromise. A slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of determining population and allocating representation in the House of Representatives. While an ethically repugnant clause today, it was a necessary political compromise that ensured Southern states would remain in the Union, preventing the nation from immediately fracturing over the issue of slavery. By the end of the summer, the delegates had designed a system based on federalism, power shared between state and national government, and separation of powers, dividing the national government into legislative, executive, and judicial branches. On September 17, 1787, 39 delegates signed the new Constitution. The work of drafting was over. The much harder task, getting the American people to accept this radical new government, was about to begin. The economic distress reached a breaking point in Massachusetts. Many farmers who had fought in the Revolution were now deep in debt. State legislatures, dominated by creditors and merchants, refused to pass debt relief laws and instead enforced foreclosures and demanded immediate payment of taxes in hard currency. In the summer of 1866, armed groups of farmers in western Massachusetts, led by former Continental Army Captain Daniel Shays, began closing down local courts to prevent foreclosure proceedings. The rebellion swelled,
eventually growing large enough to attack a federal armory in Springfield. The national government under the Articles was powerless. It could not raise an army to suppress the rebellion. Massachusetts had to privately fund a militia to put down Shays' forces. Shays' rebellion was not a massive war, but it was a devastating wake-up call. To men like George Washington, James Madison, and Hamilton, the rebellion proved that the current government was fundamentally incapable of maintaining domestic order or economic stability. They feared the chaos would lead to either anarchy or the return of a strong man. The critical period demonstrated that the government designed to prevent tyranny had become too weak to function. A profound change was necessary to save the American experiment.
The signing of the Constitution on September 17, 1787 was only the first step. The document required ratification by specially elected conventions in at least 9 of the 13 states before it could take effect. This initiated a massive, year-long public debate that became the most important political education in American history. The two sides. The country immediately split into two opposing factions, launching a fierce war of words over the future of the Republic. Federalists, proponents of the new Constitution. They included George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Their primary argument was that a strong national government was essential to save the nation from chaos, economic failure, and foreign intervention. Anti-Federalists, opponents of the new Constitution. They included powerful figures like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Samuel Adams. Their opposition was rooted in the traditional revolutionary fear that a powerful central government would inevitably become tyrannical and erode individual liberties. The Federalist Papers. To sway public opinion, 3 Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of 85 brilliant essays published in New York newspapers under the pseudonym Publius. These essays, known collectively as the Federalist Papers, are considered the most important American contribution to political theory. In these essays, they meticulously explained the workings of the new system, arguing, Federalist number 10, Madison, that a large republic, rather than a small one, was better suited to prevent the tyranny of factions, interest groups, as the greater number of diverse interests would cancel each other out. Federalist number 51, Madison, that the new system of checks and balances, pitting ambition against ambition within the 3 separate branches, would prevent any single branch or person from seizing too much power. The Anti-Federalist Objection. Despite the Federalists' persuasive campaign, the Anti-Federalists had one powerful, overarching objection that resonated deeply with the common people who remembered the struggle against the king. The Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. They argued that the new document granted sweeping powers to the national government, like the power to tax and raise armies, but it failed to include explicit guarantees protecting fundamental individual freedoms, such as freedom of speech and religion, the right to a trial by jury, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Anti-Federalists pointed out that state constitutions already had these protections, but the national government was being given all this power without any stated limits on how it could infringe upon individual liberties. Patrick Henry famously warned that without a Declaration of Rights, the new government would soon become as oppressive as the one they had just fought to overthrow. The compromise that saved the Constitution. By 1788, several states had ratified the Constitution, but the critical states of Virginia and New York, where Madison and Hamilton had done their most strenuous work, remained deeply divided. The Federalists knew they could not form a viable union without these large, influential states. To secure their ratification, the Federalists, led by Madison,
finally agreed to a crucial political deal. They promised that once the new government was operational, its very first order of business would be to amend the Constitution to include a Bill of Rights. This promise was the final turning point. Virginia and New York reluctantly ratified, giving the Federalists the necessary margin. The Constitution became the law of the land in 1788. True to his word, James Madison took the lead in the first Congress and drafted the first 10 amendments, which were ratified in 1791 and became known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments provided the necessary shield of liberty and finally completed the core documents of the American Revolution. With the Constitution ratified and the structure of the government defined, the immense task of bringing the new nation to life began. The first order of business was to elect the chief executive and establish the machinery of the federal government. The unanimous choice. The nation's first national elections were held in late 1788 and early 1789. There was only one man considered qualified to lead the new republic, George Washington. His leadership had secured the military victory, and his decision to step away from power after the war had cemented his reputation as the ultimate model of Republican virtue. In a result that has never been repeated, the Electoral College unanimously elected Washington as the first president of the United States. John Adams was elected vice president. On April 30th, 1789, Washington was inaugurated on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, then the temporary capital. He placed his hand on a Bible, took the oath of office, and added the famous phrase, "So help me God," a tradition that continues to this day. Setting the precedents. Washington understood the profound significance of his actions. As the first president, every decision he made, from what to call him to how to interact with Congress, would set a precedent that would shape the office for centuries. He moved cautiously and deliberately, intent on establishing a government that was powerful but not regal. Key precedents established by Washington. The Cabinet. The Constitution was vague on the structure of the executive branch. Washington immediately created the first presidential cabinet, appointing department heads who would serve as his chief advisors. His key appointments included Secretary of State, Jefferson, handling foreign affairs; Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, handling the nation's economy; Secretary of War, Knox. The two-term limit. After serving 2 successful 4-year terms, Washington voluntarily stepped down in 1797. He could have easily sought a 3rd term, but his resignation cemented the idea that the presidency was an office of public service, not a lifetime position, a tradition that became law with the 22nd Amendment in 1951. Neutrality in foreign conflicts. When war broke out between Great Britain and France, Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, 1793, establishing the principle that the young, fragile nation should avoid entangling foreign alliances and focus on domestic stability. The birth of political parties. Washington's administration, despite his efforts to unify the country, became the setting for the nation's first great political division. The feud primarily centered on the differing visions of Hamilton and Jefferson. Federalist Party, led by Hamilton, advocated for a strong national government, a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and a focus on industry and commerce. They favored the national bank to stabilize the economy. Democratic-Republican Party, led by Jefferson and Madison, advocated for stronger state governments, a stricter interpretation of the Constitution, and a focus on agrarian, farming interests. They feared that the national bank and Hamilton's policies favored wealthy northern elites and would lead to a corruption of the republic. This ideological clash over the size and scope of federal power resulted in the formation of the first organized political parties, a development Washington viewed with great dismay, warning against the spirit of faction in his farewell address. The completion of the Revolution. The final essential piece of the Revolution's founding documents was completed during Washington's first term. As promised, James Madison drafted and guided the passage of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, ratified in 1791 and became known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments provided the necessary shield of liberty and finally completed the core documents of the American Revolution.